Hello and welcome to another series of videotaped interviews with pioneers and pillars of the ORMS profession, organized by the Informs History and Traditions Committee. My name is Pete Horner. I'm the editor of ORMS Today, the membership magazine of Informs. I'm also the editor of Analytics, an online outreach publication from Informs aimed at the global analytics audience. Today's guest is OR pioneer and pillar Don Morrison, Professor Emeritus at UCLA. Don's remarkable academic career includes groundbreaking research in such diverse areas as marketing science and sports analytics. But perhaps his most important contribution may be his untold numbers of business school graduate students who benefited from his award-winning teaching and mentoring over the last 50 years. Don complemented his academic career with an extensive involvement with TIMSS, the Institute for Management Science. He was particularly active in the late 1980s and the early 1990s when he served as, among other things, president of the Institute from 1991 to 1992, as editor of the TIMSS flagship journal, Management Science, and also as the founding editor of the journal Marketing Science. Informs named Don to its inaugural class of Informs Fellows for his academic achievements and volunteer service to the Institute. With all of that going on, Don also managed to weave his lifelong passion for sports into his work in many interesting ways. For example, he was captain of the track team at MIT while pursuing his undergraduate degree, and I understand he was named captain of the team. Being named captain comes as no surprise, but the fact that MIT could muster enough athletes to field a track team did come as somewhat of a surprise. Finally, in a more serious vein, in addition, in the sports arena still, along with his pioneering work in sports analytics, Don has served for many years as faculty athletic representative for UCLA's intercollegiate sports program, and he has also served 3 separate, I understand, terms as president of the Pac-10, which is now the Pac-12 conference. Don, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, great to be here.
Did I get most of that right?
Yeah, you got most of it right.
Okay, all right, thank you. Speaking of sports and stats, I think a common interest of both of us, I understand that your interest in statistics was ignited to some extent by, of all people, a high school junior varsity basketball coach. Tell us about that.
Well, even as a young kid, I was interested in batting averages and things like that. But in the, I played basketball in high school, also ran track. In the 10th grade, on the junior varsity, at the end of practice, the coach would have us go off in pairs. So you and I could be shooting free throws. And it's more fun to shoot than rebound for the other guy. So maybe I make 2 shots and miss. And once you missed, then it was your turn. So maybe you made 3 and missed. Now it's my turn. But we kept track. So I was the best free throw shooter on the team. I wasn't the best player, but I was a good shooter. And I was very competitive about my free throw percentage. So I went to the coach and said, Coach Brownlee, I think you're getting a biased estimate of our free throw shooting ability. He says, what? I said, yeah, every sequence ends with a miss, so you know it's disadvantaging us. He says, Morrison, if you'd put more of those IQ points into playing better defense, you'd get more playing time. And then I said to him, but coach, don't you think it's an interesting question? He did not think it was an interesting question, and that, you know, and interestingly enough, I hadn't had any statistics courses, but if you use Neyman Pearson approach, he was getting a biased estimate. If you use a Bayesian approach, he wasn't. So anyway, but that was.
Well, thanks for sharing. That's fun. I can't imagine too many people would have asked my coach that question, but nice. Thanks for sharing that. So you went on to earn an engineering degree at MIT. Why MIT and why engineering?
Well, I was good in math and science, and people told me I should be an engineer. and it was a lot easier to get into college those days. And my parents, even though I was born and raised in Detroit, they were from Vermont, and their dream was for, you know, little Donald to go off to MIT. So I applied to Michigan, where I was a slam dunk to get in there, and MIT, and fortunately I got admitted. And I was a pretty good student, kind of a mediocre high school, but I think I got in because I was captain of the track team. That MIT was getting a little defensive about the nerdy image and so on, and of course it was mostly men. And so my entering class, the theme was educating the whole man. And so my guess is my grades and test score put me on the bubble, and then they said, "Oh, well, this guy's a pretty good athlete," so I think that got me in.
Right.
But it was a good 4 years.
Can you talk just briefly, I mean, I'm sure MIT was just crawling with important scholars and whatnot at that time. Any stand out to you?
Oh, I had some interesting professors. One of them, anyone who's taken thermodynamics, there's the Keenan and Keyes steam tables. And Joe Keenan was still there. He was this legend. And you know, engineering wasn't as scientific or whatever. And Joe Keenan, he only had a bachelor's degree. So when I was there from 57 to 61, a lot of the famous old timers did not have PhDs. That the younger faculty did, of course. Mm-hmm. Although I did not ever meet him, I knew about John Nash was a young math professor when I was a student there, and then he went on to do some amazing things,
of course,
in different ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was interesting. But you know, they worked us so hard there, and I was running track, and I had a girlfriend 13 miles away in Wellesley, and with no car, so figuring out all the logistics, I sort of no free time. So I don't think I got to know the faculty as well as I could have, or I certainly didn't take full advantage of Boston.
Well, from there, you went to Stanford, and the story I hear is you went there intending to be an MBA, or pursue an MBA, and you walked out of there with a PhD in OR. Now, how does that happen?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I had a decision to make, either go on in engineering or get an MBA. So I applied to MIT engineering and also to some business schools, decided I was going to go the MBA route, and I was fortunate enough to be admitted to Harvard, the dominant #1 business school at the time, and some other schools. And I went into my statistics professor and said, "Professor Duran, I've got this decision to make. I'm going to get an MBA, and I've narrowed it down. I'm either going to go to Harvard or Stanford. I want to go to Stanford, but I don't think my reason is very good." He says, "What's your reason?" I said, "I've just spent 4 years in Boston, and I've never been to California." He says, "That's a great reason." So I call home. I have great parents. My father didn't say a lot, very good parents. So I told him what I was doing. He said, "That's fine." So my mother got on the phone, and she was pretty free with her opinions about my girlfriends, other things. So, and she was convinced, you know, MIT, Harvard, their New England roots. Of course I was going to go to Harvard. So I told her that I was going to Stanford, and her exact words were, "How could you go to a place like that and turn down Harvard?"
Oh, boy, the farm.
But they'd never been to California. They came to visit me, and she never actually explicitly renounced that, but I could see her thinking, "Oh, my Donald, that wasn't such a bad idea."
I believe you were part of the original cohort of OR PhDs there. That must have been an amazing time and collection of talent.
So I was able to exempt a few courses, and so I took Pete Vienot's Introductory to OR class. Herb Scarf taught a linear programming class, and I thought, "No, I kind of like this stuff." And so I went in to see Jerry Lieberman and asked about transferring into the OR program. So I did. I joined. There the original 5, besides myself, were Art Jeffreyon, Bill Perscala, Bill Zangwell, and a fellow named Gene Durbin who went to work for the Rand Corporation. So I had no illusions about being the sharpest knife in the drawer.
That's quite
but I got in there and had to play a little catch-up ball. But it worked out very well. But I had this, some great summer jobs. The last 4 were at Ford Motor Company. 2 engineering type jobs and 2 kind of MBA type jobs. And my last summer job had to do with Ford versus General Motors and loyalty and reliability versus styling and so on. And that combined with a 3/4 sequence I took from Pat Suppi's in mathematical psychology was the stimulus for my dissertation. And even though I was in the OR department, my thesis advisor was Bill Massey, a marketing professor in the business school. So that's how it all got kind of tied together. And in fact, in choosing my dissertation topic, as I say, I may not have been the sharpest knife in that drawer in there, but I had a lot of common sense. So thinking, well, I could do a dissertation in optimization, but George Donzik and a few other people have done pretty well. Some of my in my cohort were doing inventory theory, and I thought, well, Errol Carlin and Scarf have done all these things. Now this quantitative marketing area, this is pretty underdeveloped, so I'll play around in that little pond, and it worked out great.
I would say so. You mentioned dancing. Now, he was at Berkeley at the time. He went to Stanford, wasn't he?
Yeah, then he went to, he was at Berkeley.
Okay, so he wasn't, okay.
But,
did your paths ever cross back in the day or at any time?
Oh yeah, when I would go back and visit at Stanford and so on, and I saw him there. Mm-hmm. But I was, just think how fortunate it was. I took classes from Harvey Wagner, Jerry Lieberman, Fred Hillier, as I mentioned, Herb Scarf, and even the mathematician Sam Carlin. So here's a little interesting story. So I survived the first linear algebra class. So now it's the survivors, and Sam teaches the second course. He'd come in 8 in the morning and say, oh, I was looking at these homework problems at breakfast this morning. They weren't too tough. So the midterm comes, and one question is, diagonalize the following matrix. Well, I couldn't diagonalize it, but there's a Cayley-Hamilton theorem. I plugged the thing in, and it couldn't be diagonalized. So he gave me extra credit. So now I'm going to the final. Man, I'm riding high. I'm at the top. 8 questions, 10 points each. I got 11.
Whoa.
Out of 80.
What happened?
Well, and I got an A minus, and you're thinking,
what?
Well, Sam must have really liked Don. Well, no. The median was 13.
That's a tough course. Wow.
So, but anyway, I had a great education at Stanford. And, the 1 year in the MBA program was incredibly good because I lived with the tribe that I was going to teach. Oh. So I was only 26 when I first started teaching, but I had lived with the tribe. Wow. So that was good.
Yeah, that was a fortunate accident, I guess you might call it. Let's talk about your dissertation. Was it based on some of your work that you did with Ford, and how did you get into from engineering to marketing science? How did that all come together?
So, my summer job at Ford, Ford was losing market share to General Motors. So this was the summer of 1963. And so I got some switching data that people turned in a Ford and they bought a Ford or they bought a Chevy or something. So I had a whole bunch of that switching data. And so I thought to myself, my dad had an Oldsmobile, he had a Plymouth, but one next door neighbor always bought a Ford. We had other people on the street who always bought Chevys. So I'm thinking there's this hardcore loyal and then sort of potential switchers. So it was a pretty simple model. I broke it down and I had the Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, all others, and There were the hardcore loyal who just zipped back. They didn't even think.
Oh, yeah. That was
And actually had data in that era, Cadillac just dominated. 87% of the people that rebought a Cadillac never even considered another car.
wow.
So that was pretty amazing, not anymore.
Yeah.
And so I found from 1960 to 1963 that with Ford and General Motors, the hardcore loyal percentages stayed almost exactly the same. But the share of the potential switcher pool, when General Motors and Ford were about even in 1960, General Motors had a little advantage, and by 1963 it was 2.5 to 1 in favor of General Motors. So they actually, it gave them some insight, and it sort of showed that the hardcore loyal thing wasn't an issue, but it was attracting the potential switchers. And they actually had me give the talk to, it didn't go all the way up to the CEO, but a couple of executive vice presidents were there, and I presented my talk to them. And so I had a Markov switching matrix and showed them how you could get what would happen in the long run. So they thought, oh, this Morrison's a pretty clever guy. And then I showed them, so I took the switching matrix for 1963. Now they thought, well, we used to have 30% of the market, that's kind of our birthright to get that. And now it's down about 22%. So I showed them with a toy example how you did it. Then I did it with this matrix. Then they're thinking, oh yeah, this is a smart guy. But it showed that they were trending towards 18%. And then they said, we're not going to 18%. So I said, look, I'm not saying, I said, I'm sure you can fix some of these numbers in the switching matrix, but if it stays like this. So it was a good learning experience for me that my whole process I was doing, they thought it was pretty good. But once the numerical conclusion was something they didn't like, they didn't think the model was necessarily so great.
For the record, what was your thesis? What was the title? Or
I think a stochastic model for brand switching behavior.
That sounds, we'll get to your book, but that sounds a lot like your book.
Oh, it is. My thesis was the stimulus for the book.
Okay, well, we'll get that in a minute. But my question right now is, at some point, you wanted to be an MBA, and then you got involved with marketing. You had a choice where you, after you get through all this, your PhD and whatnot, to go into industry or academia. You go into academia. Why?
That's interesting. So when I went to MIT, got a degree in mechanical engineering, I thought, I'm going to go back to Detroit and be an engineer at Ford Motor Company.
Sounds good.
Why not go to Detroit? They had the Lions, the Tigers, the Red Wings. Hey, where else would I go?
Sure.
So then I had this MBA experience, and I thought, well, I'll go back to Ford Motor Company, but I'll be a manager. Then I switched into the OR program, and they actually had an operations research little group, and I thought, no, what I'm going to do is go back to Ford Motor Company, and I'm going to end up running this operations research group. But then by this time, I went back. I'd been at MIT for 4 years, Stanford for 3 years. The sun is shining. I thought, I kind of like it here. So that's why I decided I'd be a professor.
You spent, 20 some odd years at Columbia?
22.
And then since 1988 or so at UCLA. Yeah. So that adds up to about 20 years of teaching.
No, 20. Close to 50.
Close to 50, excuse me. Yeah. I mean, 20. And
I had 1 year of teaching at Stanford as a lecturer while my wife finished.
Well, then that'll put you over 50.
So about 50, yeah.
That's remarkable. What I'm thinking here is much of your research and consulting seem to focus on marketing science. And then you were also the editor of that journal. What drew you to that? I mean, you mentioned some of this experience you had with Ford.
Yeah, it was. I did have some exposure to marketing. My dissertation was related to that, and I was very fortunate. The Journal of Marketing Research was founded in 1964. Bob Ferber was the editor. And so my first publication is in that journal in 1965. And it was founded, it wasn't really against the Journal of Marketing, but they wanted a journal that had more quantitative rigor to it. And there were very few people in marketing with my kind of training. So there was this journal for me, and I was pretty good in probability modeling, some of the statistics, and the ideas for my papers in those early years did not come from academic journals. So I'm at 116th Street in Broadway. I can hop on the subway down to 50th or 42nd Street. And I had a bunch of buddies in ad agencies, marketing research suppliers. There were still some corporations in Manhattan then. And particularly the ad agencies then, they had a lot of PhDs that were running research. Ben Lipstein, Lou Pringle, people. And so I would have lunch with them. It was actually in the Mad Men era. Yeah. But I did not.
I was just going to say, that's how
I was never on the account side, and I never had a 3-martini lunch, but I had a couple 2-martini lunches with these research guys.
I was going to ask you, was it?
Yeah. But it was interesting, and so, you know, everything, the stars all lined up for me. I had the appropriate educational background. I was in Manhattan, and I was connected to all these people doing kind of serious statistical probability modeling in there, and so it was just phenomenal. In fact, it's still going today. I'm a co-founder of a group called the Marketing Modelers Group. It's a great organization. It has no revenue and no cost. Different ad agencies take turns hosting it. And they always alternate an academic speaker with an industry speaker. And I started that back then, and it's still going strong.
Well, obviously, the big, huge thing going on now that with the analytics and marketing, they look like they're made for each other. That's all you talk about, knowing your customer, marketing the right thing to the right person at the right time, et cetera, et cetera. The deluge of data that we see today, everyone trying to make sense of it. That's a long, long ways from where you were back in the Madman days.
Oh, yeah.
How do you get your mind wrapped around that?
Well, one thing I'm kind of proud of is some of the models that I developed back in the 70s, early 80s. Are actually being used with these data now. Pete Fader at the Wharton School has kind of kept that stuff alive. But you're right, there's so much data on individuals, various groups, the kind of segmentation you can do. And it's interesting, just the term analytics. You know, I've been in around TIMS, ORSA, Inform since the mid-'60s, and periodically they'd have these PR initiatives. You know, we want people to know what OR is. It's not the operating room. Or what management science, well, management isn't a science, and what is it, and so on. Now analytics is so hot, and it's a lot of the stuff we were doing then. But you know, with these big data sets, if you do it correctly, and if you have some kind of underlying theory going about it, then I think it's amazing. And people have different opinions on this. But some people think you can just throw the kitchen sink at it. Every possible regression, every possible principal components, you know, visceral, doing all this stuff. And I kind of think, my view is that that's like arming a baby with a straight razor.
Nice.
Because and like in the Bible says, seek and you shall find. Yeah. And if you do that, you will find some very interesting and maybe even highly counterintuitive relationships. Mm-hmm. But it may just be statistical noise. And so, look, I'm not knocking that at all. And one of my colleagues, Mike Hansen's co-founded a company called Market Share that's doing that kind of stuff, and the company's going gangbusters. So, yeah, it's, but I'll tell you, for the young people today, that I had incredibly rigorous analytical training. But not, you know, when I was using the computer, it was the IBM 80-column cards, and if you had one typo in there, the program didn't run and all that kind of stuff. But I'll tell you today, the young people, they better have very, very good computer skills.
Well, I was going to ask you, you know, given the current environment, the crazy demand for data scientists and business students that have some quant background, what's your best advice you give to business students today, and you know, where are their opportunities? How do you see that?
Well, you know, the Anderson School at UCLA is thinking about a one-year master's degree in marketing analytics, or maybe just analytics. And I think for people who want to do that, and if they have the appropriate undergraduate education, then something like that may be a better route than a full MBA program. Now, you're not as apt to end up as the CEO of a major company, but how many regular MBAs are going to end up as a CEO?
Well, you see all these programs sprouting up from some, not necessarily the well-known business schools, but that they're trying to fill that, obviously, that demand for from the marketplace for some.
Well, I think it's a smart thing to do. Just like, you know, a plain vanilla undergraduate liberal arts degree, it, you know, doesn't lead to any particular job. It's in the same way a kind of a plain vanilla MBA, you know, maybe better than that, but when you're going out in the job market, you need to bring something to the table, something, you know, specific that you can do. You say, oh, well, you know, I know a little marketing, I know a little finance, I know a little accounting, and they say, well, yeah, good for you. Next.
We mentioned your book earlier, Stochastic Models of Buying Behavior, 1970. Now, talk just briefly about how that came about and how it was received at the time, and was that cutting edge stuff?
Yeah, it was very well received. So it's Massey, Montgomery, and Morrison, and Bill Massey, he's not much older than I, but he was the dissertation advisor for Dave Montgomery, who's my contemporary, and myself. Dave's PhD's from the business school, mine was in the OR department. And so the book is really based on the work that I was doing, and so it built from that, and then Dave's dissertation, and then Bill added a little bit at the end, and so on. But it was cutting edge, and it sold 3,000 copies. Now you might say, well, 3,000 copies, but a typical university press book sells way less than 1,000. So MIT Press published it, and so you know, Dave and I and Bill, we actually even made a few little royalties on it.
Okay.
But
was it a fun process, or was it a grind, or is it just something you want to get out there? Or?
Oh, it was a fun process that I think MIT Press came to us after Dave, when he left Stanford, was an assistant professor at MIT. So I think he got MIT Press involved with it. Mm-hmm. And look, a lot of the chapters, two of the chapters are right out of my dissertation. At least one chapter is right out of Dave's. I wrote a general chapter on the statistical methodology, and Bill added something to it. And it was, yeah, you know, I'm just patting myself on the back, but it was used in virtually all the doctoral seminars related to sort of quantitative modeling, Markov chains, stochastic processes. So yeah, you know.
Sports analytics. You were out there, I'd want to call you a pioneer in this area, and I think you were, long before anyone ever heard of the Moneyball or any of what we hear today. Can you tell me a little bit about that and some of the work you did in that area?
Okay, my first one, that I grew up in Detroit, Red Wing fan, big Gordie Howe fan, and so on. And So watching games, I noticed that about 1 minute left in the game, if a team was down by 1 goal, they'd pull their goalie. So I'm thinking to myself, well, if you get down 1 goal with 59 minutes left, you're not going to pull your goalie because you're most apt to be down by 2. But you're not going to wait till 10 seconds because not much can happen. So there's got to be some best time. So I thought, well, you get the Poisson process with goals scoring this way, then you pull your goalie, your rate goes up, but the empty net goes up even more. And so I developed the optimal time to pull a goalie based on the Poisson scoring rates. Well, I can get the scoring rates for, because most of the games it's 6-on-6. So I just made the assumption that a power play was like an empty nest. Well, not a bad assumption, may not have been true, but I did that. And so I wrote the paper, and I told John Little about it at MIT. And about every 2 years I would go up to MIT from Columbia and give a talk. So I was scheduled to give that talk at the OR Center. So about 7 in the morning, John Little calls me at home and says, wear a blue shirt. I said, why do you want me to wear a blue shirt? He says, you're going to be on TV. And in those days, before color TV, the white shirts weren't so good. They liked to have a blue shirt. And so somebody in the Boston Globe or somebody heard about this, because they sent the seminar, and they taped it, gave the talk. So I had a little fun with that. And then Fortune magazine, not anymore, they had this little thing called Potpourri. And the U.S. in the elimination round was down 1 goal to Finland, this is 1980 Olympics, pulled the goalie, got a tie, and got a point that helped them get into the medal round. And so they wrote about this in my paper. And a guy in the National Hockey League read that and sent me 2 years of data for every time a goalie was pulled and what happened. So now I had the data. Oh. And I got the real rates on that, revised the paper, and there was some replies and rejoinders and so on. And so so I started that in the mid-70s. So I guess you could sort of say I was one of the pioneers in analytics. But I sent the paper to the Knicks and the Islanders, no response. One of my colleagues had an aunt that worked with the Boston Bruins, no response. But when I got out here, I met Bruce McNall before he was convicted of his con scheme, and gave him a copy of the paper. He gave it to Roger Vachon, who was the general manager of the Kings, and I think the Kings actually used it a little bit.
Goalie too, wasn't he?
Yeah, Vachon was a goalie.
Did my author of Moneyball, Michael,
Moneyball, Michael Lewis.
Michael Lewis. Did he reference you or credit you or anything?
No, but there'd be no real reason. And the Moneyball, I've not done really anything serious with baseball.
Okay.
Although it's interesting that even before Moneyball, most statistical analyses would say a man on first with no outs generates more expected runs than a man on second with 1 out. So even if the bunt works, it's going against it. But still, people do it all the time.
You can't fight.
But once the sabermetrics came in and the Billy Bean, that basketball is doing it now. I actually was down in the Lakers headquarters. Mitch Kupchak's a good friend of mine. He actually has an Anderson MBA. He got injured, had a long rehab. He's a smart guy, and got about 80% of an MBA, and then finished up in the off season when he went back to playing. But anyway, of course the Lakers need more than my help to get back. But it turns out that their head analytics guy is a former PhD student of mine.
Most of the teams do have analysts.
Oh, they do, yeah.
Yeah, it's a commonplace. But you were there. You were there on the
was
ground
there,
floor. You also served, as we mentioned earlier, as president of the Pac-10, or now the Pac-12. I was just wondering, did you ever try to, apply some of your analytical knowledge and some modeling to, let's say, scheduling or some other problems that could have been addressed?
I put some of the ADs and the staff in touch with people who do scheduling. Who's an Informs guy at Carnegie Mellon's done a lot of that.
Jonathan Coppins?
No. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So, but you say I was president 3 times. Now, a faculty athletics representative is always the president. Now, I like to think I did some good things in my presidency, but it rotates. And I think my 3rd or 4th year, I was president, it was my turn, and then my 13th or 14th year. But I only did it for 20 years, but we added 2 schools, and the rotation would have put a brand new faculty rep as a president. So they said, Don, would you do it? So that's a record that may never be broken, because now there's 12 schools, and for someone to do it 3 times, even if they did it in their first year, then the second time would be the 11th year, and the third time would be in the 21st year.
You mentioned a faculty athletic rep. What exactly does that mean, and what does that entail, and why did you spend so many years doing it? 15.
Well,
you just retired from that last year.
The official responsibilities are that you make sure that the school abides by the NCAA bylaws and that all the athletes who compete are academically eligible. Now, at UCLA, we really do have a culture of compliance. We want to do it the right way. More than half of our head coaches were elite UCLA athletes. They really think about the whole institution, not just their sport. So I didn't really have to be a policeman. You know, at some schools, you would have to be. Mm-hmm. And that freed up a lot of my time to get to know the athletes, mentor them, help them with graduate schools, with jobs. So I could, we don't have that much time, but I could tell you amazing stories. One, a 3-year starter on the O-line had never considered a Rhodes Scholarship. And I convinced him to apply, nagged him until he did, and he got it. It helped some people obviously get into business schools, but medical schools and law schools. So that's the most rewarding part, and I still keep in touch with them. In fact, just recently I had a very in-depth conversation with Earl Watson, who played 13 years in the NBA. Yeah. And so I know quite a few people in the NBA and the NFL. It's really remarkable, and I was 75 with 20 years in, and it's kind of like an entertainer on stage. You want to leave the stage when they still want one more song or one more thing. Yeah. And I thought,
you got out there. Apparently there's no OR angle to this except what you mentioned. The education is stressing the education is an important part of what you were doing there.
No, it's a big part of my life, but it's not so much connected with OR. But.
I know time is running out, but can we just talk briefly about your family? I know that your wife's been quite involved with you. You have supportive parents. Can you just talk briefly about your family and the support and where some of this academia?
Look, I was very fortunate. 2 biological parents, very supportive. My father had the same job. We had the same neighbors on each side. I had the pretty much stress-free in Detroit. Yeah, when Detroit was thriving.
Okay.
And then in graduate school, I met Sherry, my wife, and she's a world-class immunologist. She was on the medical school faculty at Columbia. She's now a professor of a joint college and medical school department at UCLA. She's had a very lucrative patent. She's really an amazing scientist. I had 2 daughters. They both ended up with UCLA MBA degrees. One of them lives literally across the street from us with 2 of our 3 grandsons. The other lives across the country in Connecticut. But they've had very good business careers. I got 2 great sons-in-law, 3 healthy grandsons. So yeah, and everybody's doing well. So I feel very blessed in that sense.
Teaching doesn't always, in my opinion, get the accolades it deserves, and not just in the OR community, but in general. You've spent, as we discussed, 50 years teaching business grad students. I don't want to say what's the secret, but what was your philosophy? What made you so successful? And
well, I think
what do you say about that?
I was a good teacher of MBA courses, the basic statistics, operations research, kind of marketing research classes. But my real passion was the PhD students. Now, I think the MBA students liked me, but they didn't want to be me. They wanted to be out in industry and so on. Where the PhD students, they want to be me.
And you had 18?
Well, I was on a lot. I supervised 18 doctoral dissertations, and they've all done well. 8 of them currently have endowed chairs at major universities. And what I'm even more proud of is, I guess I kind of have the no-jerk rule in terms of taking on a PhD student. And these students now range in age from probably 72 to early 40s. Every single one is with their first spouse. So I'm very proud of that. I like to think that Sherry and I had combined careers and family and so on that, you know, I don't take full credit for the no divorces, but I like to think that, you know, I was
going on there.
That, you know,
you screened them carefully, or something happened.
And was a good role model.
And they were happy, obviously, in their life and in their marriage.
Yeah.
So, just to wrap up with a couple of things. Looking back on your contributions to the field, what stands out to you is what are you most proud of in terms of what you've done? And you've done
number one by far is how well my PhD students have done. Mm-hmm. You know, I've received some awards and got some recognition, but nothing, and it just goes exponentially because my PhD students have their PhD students who have their PhD students. So my academic family tree is very bushy with lots of accomplishment. And
that would be interesting to make that.
So that's what I'm most proud of. And I think in terms of teaching probability and statistics, I think my engineering background helped. I was very good at getting the intuition across. For example, in multivariate statistics, I'd bring in a 3-dimensional oval rock. And before I got into eigenvalues, eigenvectors, multivariate normal, principal components, I'd pass it around, and then I'd say, guys, the next few weeks there's going to be some kind of complicated algebra, but everything you need to know is contained in this rock. The principal axes, the ratio of the lengths, and so on. And I think there are not too many advanced statistics courses where people bring rocks into the classroom, and I always tell them that if you see it, you own it. If you only memorize the algebraic equation, you're not even renting the concept. Mm. So I'm proud of, I think that's what I'm proud of in my teaching. And I'm also proud of the number of key positions I held at TIMS and then Informs. You know, I put in a lot of time and effort. I think I did a good job, but I enjoyed it. Worked with good people.
Any memorable, your year and a half, or whenever you were president of TIMS, what?
Oh yeah, I remember the year. It was the last year of TIMS before the merger. You know, I think actually the 2 things I most remember is working closely with Mary DeMillam. I just adored her. Mm-hmm. And when I was the founding editor of Marketing Science, Judy Larrabee, who lived in Rhode Island, was the copy editor. You know, it was a lot of paper and pencil those days. And I had the greatest conversations with her about the Red Sox, about the Civil War. You really got to know her, and unfortunately she died of cancer at a young age. In fact, they asked me to write a little tribute to her in one of the issues, which I also did for Jerry Lieberman. So those were memorable for me, the people.
You have many, many memories, and it was obviously you've enjoyed a wonderful life, wonderful career. You seem to have done amazing things in a number of things. But everyone's got a bucket list. Is there something out there you still want to do, like a book to write, or I don't know, a place to go, a person to meet?
Well,
what haven't you done that you would like to?
What I should do, but I won't do, is write a multivariate statistics textbook, because I think the way I teach it would enable a much broader group of people to really understand and be able to intelligently use the material. But I'm 76 years old. I still have to work on my golf game and so on, not do that. But I think, you know, as you said, I've had such a good life. I've had no regrets, and I would like to someday shoot my age in golf, and this won't happen. I always wanted to have a probability distribution named after me, the well-known Morrison distribution, but that didn't happen.
Well, we're just about out of time. One last question. How would you like to be remembered? Say.
I think if I could be remembered as being a good husband, father, a colleague, and a mentor, and someone who always tried to be kind and do the right thing, that would be great. You know, much more, these things to me mean much more than various awards that I've won. So that's how I'd like to be remembered.
Excellent. Well, let's end it on that note. Thank you so much, Don. I really enjoyed our conversation.